Hey, everybody. Welcome to Splintered Spirits, the podcast hosted by me, Gary, and my nephew, John Santa from Santa Paranormal, where we try to answer the question, what are spirits? By talking to different experts in the paranormal field, mediums, investigators, or evaluating documenting spirit communication. Now, if you ever joined our live stream, you've probably seen the comments, turn to Jesus, or stop talking to demons, or these are Satan's minions. Listen, we get it. People are scared. But scared of what exactly? This week, I'm diving headfirst into the devil's playground, not to summon him, but to understand why Satan has such a grip on our collective imagination. Joining us is Dr. Joseph Laycock, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Texas State University, and an expert in what most of us were told to stay far, far away from: new religious movements, aka cults, exorcism, spirit possession, and the moral panics that swirl around them. He's the author of Satanism from Cambridge Elements, The Exorcist Effect, Religion, Horror, and Demonic Belief, and the upcoming Penguin Book of Cults out this October. Today we're asking, who is Satan really? Why does his image still terrify millions? And why do some people think talking about ghosts is the first step to inviting the devil into your home? Let's separate the fear from the facts and see if the devil's really in the details. Let's dive into the conversation. Professor Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
Where do I find you?
I am in Austin, Texas.
Is that where you're from
I am
originally?
from Austin. Yeah, I grew up here.
And you decided did growing up in Texas have anything to do with your field of study?
A little bit in that, I was a scrawny, nerdy kid and I liked to play Dungeons and Dragons back in the 80s. And, everybody told me that this was satanic and I was going to end up worshiping the devil and committing suicide. So, and now that Stranger Things is out, everybody was like, oh, yeah, that was a thing in the 80s, wasn't it? That was my life.
Oh my God, that's great. That's funny. Let me throw this on here so I'm getting feedback from all that. Dude, I grew up in, look, I'm 50 years old. I grew up in the 80s and in the 90s as well. And we had all of that satanic panic and all of that stuff, which is insane. And it's hilarious. And the reason really, I'm so glad you were able to join me today, because the reason I wanted to talk to you is because ever since I started this podcast with my nephew, the comment section, I guess I'm going to hell, dude, in a handbasket. I'm going to be delivered there. My nephew gets it constantly. It's like when he's talking to spirits, it's all, these are demons. What are you doing? You're letting yourself in, you're letting them come into your life. The devil, you're letting the devil in. And I wanted to get to the bottom of, basically the devil, or the devil you think, what does that mean? And why do we think the way we do about the devil? Right. So tell me, let's just start at the beginning. What was the Satan originally in text?
Right. So, what I tell my students in religious studies is I can't tell you whether the devil is real or not, right? That's up to you. I work for the state of Texas. We don't want the government telling you what to believe about God or the devil. What I can talk about, though, is how people throughout history have understood the devil, and that has definitely changed. So, if you read the Hebrew Bible, which Christians know as the Old Testament, Satan's basically not in it. And Christians will say, "What are you talking about? Satan gives Eve, makes her eat the apple." But if you actually read Genesis 3, it says the serpent was the cleverest of all the wild animals. That's what it says. Nowhere does it say the devil turned himself into a snake and all this kind of stuff. That was later. Christians interpreted the serpent to be the devil. And then later we have the book of Job, which is probably where the devil gets the most play in the Hebrew Bible. And that starts out in heaven, and Satan just walks up to God in heaven. And it's pretty clear that he does this all the time, that he and God are cool, right? If you read, if you read the book of Job, Satan and God are basically friends, and they make this bet about, this Job, who's his very loyal follower but has a pretty sweet life. And Satan says, "Yeah, but I bet if I ruin Job's life, he won't worship you anymore, right? He's just a suck up." So Satan in this story doesn't like people at all. He's very anti-people, but he's very pro-God. And Satan means the adversary in the sense of like a prosecuting attorney, right?
Right. And in the story you just described, isn't that basically then, you know, Trading Places was a remake of the Book of Job, where the two rich guys just, screwed with Dan Aykroyd the entire time in that sense to see if he would turn to crime.
Yeah, it
Right?
is
I mean, it's just essentially
it's the original riches to rags
right,
story, right?
right.
And what also gets left out, and at the end of the story, Job has this sort of conversation with God where he doesn't curse him, but he says, "Why are you doing this?" And God says, "You don't ever get to question me. I'm freaking God." And then he restores all of Job's wealth and his cattle and stuff like that. But Satan had killed Job's kids, and those kids are still just as dead at the end of the story. Job gets to have new kids. Um, but it's an ancient text, and it's from a very kind of brutal time in human history, right? Also, at no point does Job say, "Oh well, I get to go to heaven because I was loyal." They didn't believe in heaven back then. And he says, "I have nothing to look forward to but descending into Sheol," and Sheol is the underworld, basically. People understood that you die and you just sort of have this shadowy existence in the ground, right? And so when Christianity comes along, things have changed, and Jews are now living under the influence of the Roman Empire. They're shaped by Greek culture and Greek philosophy, and they've encountered a religion out of Persia called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism says there's a god of good and a god of evil, and they're basically both equally powerful, right? The other thing that's happened is the story that the Jews have told themselves is there's only one God in the whole world, and he only has one temple, and it's in Jerusalem. That's the only place he can be worshipped. And a bunch of people who pray to Zeus came and conquered it. So how does that work? And they said, okay, well, God is a God of love, and he's all powerful. So he must have let something evil take over the world. So God's not really in control. He's temporarily put this evil power in control of us. Who could it be? Who could this evil power be? Well, when they go and look at the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, they've got two things they can work with. So they've got Satan, who hates humans but is loyal to God. And then in Genesis 6, there's this weird passage that says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men and that they were beautiful. And they came down and they had children, and the children were called the Nephilim, and there were giants in the earth. It's a really weird passage. You see this passage on ancient aliens and stuff like that all the time. Okay, but so now we have Satan, who's loyal to God but doesn't like people, and we have these angels who descend, who like people a little bit too much. Actually, that's kind of their problem. But they disobey God, and you put those together, and you have what Satan is in Christianity, which is a fallen angel who hates humans and hates God. And now we can say this is why the world isn't working the way it's supposed to work, because this character, Satan, is temporarily running the show.
That is super interesting. It really is. It's like I grew up Catholic, and now I would say I'm an atheist of it. And my interpretation of the devil is that he inspires the best music, primarily, right? So, and it's like yeah, and it's the coolest. But and it's I never understood that. Like, wait a minute. It always felt to me when they would tell us, these fire and brimstone that sort of probably stemmed, come from Dante's Inferno, that sort of imagery or something, then that here's this guy who's punishing all the bad people. And to me, my whole thing growing up in the Catholic faith was like, well, that seems like he's working with God. And so it's like, if he's punishing bad people, that's just, that seems like he's in cahoots. It'd almost be like if he was luring me in to do bad stuff, I'd be rewarded by that guy. Why would he make me like try to trick me and then hurt me later? What that's weird. If he's trying to get even with that guy, I'd be like, hey, come to my house. My parties are better. Like, that's how I always thought of it. So it never made sense that there was like, and then, like God would punish you. Well, that goes against everything that you're taught that what God is about. So it's like, you know what, you did a bad thing. Sorry, you're going to jail. Run by my guy down there. But then you're trying to also tell me he's not your guy. He's your adversary who wants to be you. So why would he help you with this prison system? Eh, Like and then I was out. I'm like, you know what? This. There's clearly just a scare tactic to try to prevent to keep me in control. I just always felt it was a control tactic. Is that when did that sort of idea? And I'm sure I'm not the first person to have that idea. So when is that? How did that start to come about, or when did that sort of philosophy or thing start to break through the system in a way?
Yeah, so God has always had, a big stick, right? Uh, and the traditional Israelite understanding of course God is going to hurt you if you don't follow God's laws. Of course he will, and he probably won't do it in person. God has all kinds of monsters that do his bidding. God has hitmen. He'll have you swallowed by a whale. He'll send flying venomous serpents at you. I mean, he'll do all this awful stuff. And I think if you were to
He's
tell
got
the
it's quite
Israelites,
the video game, isn't it, Joe? It's quite the
that's right.
video game.
Yeah, there's a book that just came out by Esther Hamori called God's Monsters, and it describes all these like messed up creatures in the Hebrew Bible. And basically, God is king of the monsters. God made all these things in case you ever cross him. And I think if you went to the ancient Israelites and you said, your God sounds really cruel, they would probably say, yeah, he's cruel. Like, so what? He's powerful. He's the
Right.
most powerful thing in the universe. So we're going to follow him no matter what he says. I'll
Right.
kill my own kid if he tells me to, right?
Right. Right.
Um, it's
Right.
only later when you have this idea of God loves us, God doesn't want anything bad to happen to humans. Now we have a problem, right? Now we have to find some way to justify what in religious studies is called the problem of evil, right? Why is it so terrible to be a human being with all the stuff we have to deal with if the world is being run by this all powerful, all loving God? And an attempt to solve that is to say, well, there's this figure, the devil. The devil causes all the bad stuff. God causes all the good stuff.
That's crazy. That's right. You said earlier, you mentioned like you described him as a prosecutor or like an attorney. Is that like that's what the word means?
Yeah, it's in the sense of like one who is accusing you, right? And not like accusing you in like a mean girl making up a rumor about you, but really trying to say like you haven't done what you said you're going to do. Like you're in breach of contract, right? You had a covenant with God, you didn't keep it. And maybe Satan is right, and you really actually deserve to be punished. And maybe Satan's doing his job a little too enthusiastically, and you actually deserve some mercy. But that's what the word Satan kind of originally signified.
It's fascinating. So what? So as I said, like in our chat, in our podcast, and in the chats and in our live streams, we get a lot of people telling us to turn to Jesus or rebuke Satan. Right? What do you think it is about the paranormal that triggers this like evangelical panic in people who are super religious to do that to us?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we know sociologically from sociologists who study paranormal beliefs, if you believe in God, you're more likely to hold a paranormal belief. And they define paranormal beliefs as believing in ghosts, believing in UFOs, believing in psychic abilities and things like this. But they also found that if you go to church services every week, you're less likely to believe in paranormal things. And what they attribute that to is you have pastors and priests saying, all this stuff, it's demonic, it's of the devil, right? And to some extent sociologically this is about brand, right? If you're telling people our church and our Bible and our tradition, we know about the supernatural, we know about all the secret forces in the universe, you don't want people then going and talking to a psychic, right, or talking to a medium. You want them to be coming to you and kind of getting all of their truth from you. And so very early on in the history of Christianity, by about the 2nd century, there was this idea of, well, the other gods that people pray to, Zeus and the gods of Rome and all this stuff, it's not that they aren't real. They're real, but they're actually demons. These are actually fallen angels who have tricked humanity into thinking that they are gods of thunder and love and war and wisdom and so forth. And what they really want humans to do is, first of all, worship them instead of the one true God. And second, to give them blood sacrifices, because that was a common practice in the Roman Empire when Christianity was beginning, is you would make animal sacrifices to the gods. And
In
Christian
the
writers,
Christianity. To be
Christianity would not
clear,
make animal sacrifices. I mean, that's one reason why Christians were kind of singled out, as they
right?
said, you
Because
know,
it wasn't doing what the Romans were doing. Like the Romans were into it, Christians were like, no, okay.
exactly. And the pagans would say, look, look at all the wonderful things that Rome has done, and the gods have given us victory over enemies. And you won't sacrifice like a dove? What's wrong with you? Right? But the Christians would say, because you're not giving that bloody animal to, some benevolent god like Zeus, you're giving it to a demon. You're giving it to someone who lost a war thousands of years ago in heaven. And that idea is pretty firmly established in Christianity within only a couple centuries.
That's okay. Right. It's so amazing. What are some of the most comparable, you know, in other faiths? How does that all tie into this idea of Satan and Jesus? And it's like when you start looking at like, yeah, this guy over here had 12 apostles and this person here had like where does the devil sit in other faiths and other practices, and how does that compare to what we all know, or what these other people believe is the devil today?
Yeah, so most Jews don't really believe in a devil, right? Because they would say it's really not in our sacred texts. There
Hmm.
are Judaism's a very old, diverse religion. There's lots of different forms of Judaism, and there are things like the Dybbuk, which is a possessing spirit that appears in Jewish folklore and things like that. There are stories of rabbis who are exorcising demons. And the other religion of the book is Islam. And in Islam, the devil is called Iblis, which means the whisperer, and pretty similar to the devil in Christianity. But the difference is that the devil is either an angel or something called a jinn. And the jinn are made from fire, and they're like human beings. Angels don't really have free will in Islam, but jinn can choose to be good or they can choose to be evil. And so Iblis is told by God, I've created this thing. It's called Adam. It's a human. It's awesome. I want everybody to come and bow to it. It's my best creation. And Iblis refuses. He says, I'm not going to bow to this thing that you made out of dirt because that would make me a bad Muslim. Right? Muslims are only to honor God. I'm not going to honor something that's not yours. And they get into this argument. And Iblis says, I'm going to show you your creation actually isn't that great. And so Iblis means the whisperer. So the idea is Iblis is constantly kind of tempting us to disobey a God, to choose our own path instead of what God wants for us. And there are traditions in Islam that eventually this squabble between God and Iblis will be reconciled. So it's a somewhat more sympathetic view of this figure than in Christianity, where it's really just absolute evil and has to be destroyed. And then other religions also have to explain the problem of evil. And so, if, for example, in Buddhism, we have this figure called Mara, who's often associated with the devil by Christians when they look at Buddhism. And Mara is basically the god of reality as we know it, right? So Buddhism says we're kind of living in the matrix and we have to become enlightened and sort of transcend the cycle of death and reincarnation. And Mara doesn't want anybody to do that. And so when Buddha is about to become enlightened after years of meditation, Mara sends like sexy, like nymph women to try to distract him. Mara unleashes an army of demons on him, and the Buddha turns their arrows into flower blossoms, just like we see in the Matrix. So it's a different tradition from a different part of the world, but there are some similarities of there's kind of this invisible force that controls the world, and our religion is helping us to fight back against it.
So it sounds like every person or religion needs a scapegoat, and the easiest one is Satan. Is that fair to say? It's like we have to figure out how to.
Yeah, everybody wants to explain the problem of evil, right? Now, if you have a religion like the Yoruba religion of West Africa, where you have multiple gods and goddesses, they might just say, well, yeah, some of those gods are jerks, right? So that's why bad things are going to happen. But if you have a religion that says, well, kind of there's this order to the universe, right? Or especially there's an all powerful, all loving God, well, now the problem of evil is much harder to solve. And the sort of Christian version of, well, God caused all the good stuff, Satan caused all the bad stuff, doesn't act from a philosophical perspective, does not fully solve it. right?
Right.
Because Christians say, well, God will punish Satan, though, right? Jesus will return and Satan will be cast into a lake of fire. God's only allowing this to go on for a little while. But a philosopher might say, okay, but if I have a vicious pit bull and I just let it loose at a park and it starts mauling children, and I say, don't worry, in 5 minutes, I'm going to leash my pit bull and it won't maul children anymore. Well, I'm going to jail for that.
Right.
Right?
Right. Yes.
I'm not innocent of the damage that my pit bull that I've unleashed is doing. And Christians might say, well, but that's trying to judge God by the standards that we would judge a human or whatever. But in philosophy, when you really get to questions like, why are some babies born with leukemia?
Yeah.
Right? It's really hard to say that fact of our life can be reconciled with this idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God. It's hard.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It's like I think in my philosophy class back in the day, it was, if God is all powerful, can he create a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it? Right. Like that was the fun game. So as this, how was the start? Satanism or the Church of Satan, or these sort of like as a religion? How far back is that? Can that be true? Is that like the late 60s or is it even earlier? And then how did that come about in this thing?
Right. So I mean, this is contentious history, right? What we can all agree on is in 1966, Anton LaVey creates this religion called the Church of Satan, and it's an above ground religion with members. And there's people who are saying, "I am a Satanist. Here's my membership card," and so forth. Right?
Right.
Did Satanism exist before that? It's pretty murky, right? I mean, there are conspiracy theorists who will actually say, "Well, Satanism is older than Christianity," which historically speaking, that doesn't make any sense. But those kinds of claims are out there that this is this ancient a cult that goes back to child sacrifice in the Old Testament, stuff like that. The word Satanism appears in the 1500s when we have the Protestant Reformation and Europe enters 200 years of wars over religion, right? So prior to that, the only church in Europe was the Catholic Church. Now you have Catholics and Protestants fighting each other, and pretty quickly these accusations get made of, you say you're a Christian, but you are actually a Satanist, right? You actually worship Satan. And then the Catholic Church says, well, we believe in transubstantiation. So when we do communion, we believe that the bread and wine. So transubstantiation, Catholics begin to say, when we do communion, the priest has the power to miraculously turn the wine into Jesus' blood and turn the wafer into Jesus' flesh. And these rumors start to form that Satanists are sneaking into Catholic churches, and they're trying to wait until communion when those holy wafers are passed out and sneak them away and take them home, because that's actually Jesus' body. And now the Satanists, because the Satanists know that everything the Catholic Church says is really true, can now stomp on that wafer in a black mass and basically torture Jesus, right? And
Dude, let me tell you this real quick. I went to Catholic school for 8 years. A lot of the kids in my class were altar boys. They would constantly sneak into the rectory and steal the wafers and keep them in their pockets to have a snack in class.
yeah.
And it was like some of the unused ones that were blessed, during the daily masses that didn't get taken. It's like they would just take those, they have them in their pocket, and they're just sitting there snacking during the, you know what I mean? It was like, it's
Yeah.
Satanists, a lot of them.
So if it hasn't been blessed, it's just a cracker. But once it's blessed, that's actually
Yes,
Jesus'
they were
flesh.
blessed.
But what's
Yeah.
important here is, as far as we know, there were no Satanists, right? Nobody was
Right.
coming to steal these wafers. This was an argument that they were using against Protestants, right? And it was basically the logic of like the old cereal commercials with like Lucky the Leprechaun, the Trix Rabbit, and stuff, right? The cereal's got to be good because all these cartoon characters are trying to steal it all the time, right? Our interpretation of communion must be true because why are the Satanists coming for it all the time? So
Right.
so beginning in the 1500s, we have all these people being accused of being Satanists. We even have some people who are put on trial for basically holding black masses and are executed and stuff like that. What's not clear, though, was any of this ever real? Was anybody ever actually doing this? And some historians disagree. Most historians, I think, would say probably not, right? Probably these were just sort of urban legends. Some of them say, well, maybe there's a little grain of truth to this. And, if you tell an urban legend enough, people will kind of act it out. So we don't really know if there were any Satanists before Anton LaVey, but Anton LaVey sort of took all these rumors, which he learned about through novels and horror movies, and said, I'm going to do this in real life. I'm going to take the parts of Satanism I saw in these horror movies that I think are cool, which is the rebellion and the kind of, resistance to authority, and the parts about, killing babies or whatever, that I'm just going to leave behind because I'm making this up anyway. So I can just use the parts that I like.
Right. I mean, did he get a lot of inspiration from like, Crowley, like Aleister Crowley and stuff like that? Isn't that part of his whole
Yeah. I mean,
and that's like the early that's isn't that the early 1900 like what's Aleister Crowley, the 20s?
yeah,
Am I
Aleister
do I have
Crowley's
that right?
heyday was basically the 20s, right? Yeah, so Crowley definitely studied Aleister Crowley. He said that he didn't take anything from him, but he definitely did. If you read the Satanic Bible, which by the way, the Satanic Bible came about because of the movie Rosemary's Baby in 1968. And
Right.
that was a novel. First, it was a best-selling novel. So Avon came to Anton LaVey and said, "Could you write something? It could be really anything, but as long as it mentions like Satan and witchcraft, we can sell this book. There's a huge market." So LaVey kind of slammed together the Satanic Bible, and so for parts of it, he took the so-called Enochian keys, which are part of kind of ceremonial magic that he would have learned about through studying Crowley. So that's part of the contents of that book. So Crowley was an influence. There was a French novel called La Basse, which describes a black mass in Paris. And he took that and kind of used the novel to kind of make a black mass a ritual. There were movies from the 30s and 40s, old black and white movies that depicted satanic cults. So he drew on that as well. And so he was just really good at kind of taking bits and pieces from all over the place and putting together a religion and also a kind of philosophy, a kind of humanist philosophy of trying to be your best self and kind of have the most fun.
So and unlike L. Ron Hubbard, he really couldn't figure out how to make that kind of money out of it either. So unfortunately. So it's like which is that's amazing to me. So, you know, that so if you started that in around the 60s, I guess then that would lead you to like the 80s, which is that satanic panic. And I'm actually I think I mentioned I have another project, a documentary project I'm working on about the West Memphis Three, and I know one of the attorneys from that case with those kids, those teens were railroaded, and it was due to the satanic panic of the late 80s, early 90s. What again, does it just still come down to the same thing? Is it's just the unexplained and just finding a reason to hate, and it must be Satan? I mean, is that really what the satanic panic was all about back then, like in that level?
Well, it's interesting because Christianity has always taught that there's a devil, but in certain periods in Christian history, the idea of the devil has been very much downplayed. In other parts, it's been really amped up. And occasionally, you get not only is there the devil, but the devil has human agents, which in early modern Europe they would have said are witches, right? They would have gone on witch hunts. And the 80s was basically just a witch hunt, except now we're calling the witches Satanists. So the question sociologists try to answer is what is it? What's going on in the culture where this flares up? What causes it to flare up? And one interpretation I think is plausible is that when society starts to change too fast, some people freak out and start basically accusing their neighbor, right, of being a witch or a Satanist or something like that, right? So the Dark Ages in Europe really didn't have a lot of witch hunting. People believed in witches, but they generally were not burning people at the stake. And then once the wars of religion start and people things start changing very fast, now I have thousands of people accused of witchcraft. So one interpretation is the 60s, a lot of change real fast, a lot of changes to the
Yeah.
culture. And the 70s, which is really where the satanic panic begins, is kind of the hangover, right, for that revolution of the 1960s. And so you get very early on Christians kind of making these wild claims about satanic conspiracies. And then the 80s, it really explodes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But one thing that people have noticed is it was mostly daycare providers who were being accused of being Satanists. So they would say, you drop your kid off at daycare, you pick them up at the end of the day. Well, the daycare provider is a Satanist. and they were like torturing your kid and things like this all day, and they have them cleaned up when you pick them up from school. So the longest, most expensive trial in American history before the O.J. Simpson trial was the McMartin preschool trial, where this whole family was accused of basically running a satanic daycare center. And of course, it was all made up. So here's the thing: why, if you said someone in your town is a Satanist, you probably wouldn't think it must be the preschool teacher, right?
Not
So,
today, for
right.
sure. But was that because people started to work, or when people started to use daycare more? Is that where you're
Exactly.
going?
Exactly, because in the 80s, we switched from the kinda Leave It to Beaver family where dad goes to work and mom stays home, to now the norm is the two-income family. So what sociologists think happened is a lot of parents felt, "I'm forced to send my kid to all these people that I don't know, these strangers." And so it felt like there was this evil force trying to, undermine your authority as a parent and mess up your kids. And the claim of the daycare is run by Satanists, it kind of gave expression to that frustration. So we don't really know quite why the Satanic Panic got so bad when it did in the 80s, but definitely changing economics was a factor. The realization that child abuse is a thing, that there really are people who abuse children, was probably a factor as well. And then repealing the fairness doctrine in media set the stage for things like the Geraldo Satanism special, right, which really scared the hell out of a lot of Americans. So sensational media was part of it too.
It's amazing how many things can be traced back to Geraldo, by the way. When you really start to dig into it, like some of the stuff that he discovered, and stories he broke, and culturally changed, fascinating to me.
Well, I was
Uh,
on Geraldo in 2009. I had lunch with the guy who produced that Satanism special in 1988, and he just said our ratings were so good, we just killed it with the Satanism special. He was so proud all these years
right.
later.
So many people's lives have been ruined by it. So thank you. I'm so glad the ratings were so high. Poor kids who just liked heavy metal music. How does this lead to, this belief, and whether the psychological aspect of Satanism or believing in Satan, how does that play into possession as a religious concept and as a psychological or cultural phenomenon? Like when you're talking about possession, and if you're possessed, it's never by anybody cool. It's always by the devil. It's like, it's just like, it's not, Frank Sinatra isn't possessed, man. I didn't learn to sing really well and start picking up chicks at every bar. It's like, no, it's the devil. You know what I mean? It's like, what's the deal? How did that roll out?
Yeah, so possession is also, it's one of these things where there's really no possession in the Old Testament. No one's getting possessed by demons. If they are, it actually says it's an evil spirit of the Lord, right? So God wants you to be possessed and freak out. In the New
Right.
Testament, though, first of all, people are getting possessed everywhere. Everybody's possessed. Jesus has to cast out demons. His apostles has to cast out demons, and these are demons, right?
Okay.
And it's not quite queer. It's not quite clear what people in the first century understood a demon to be, but they're definitely not from God. These are kind of evil things, and the way that we know Jesus is the Messiah is he has this ability to command them. So that's really baked into core Christian text, right? People get possessed by demons, and Christians are the true religion because they have the power to cast this out, right? And in other religions, there is also spirit possession, but in most cultures that are not Christian, like you said, it's a little bit more neutral. So if you're getting possessed, it could be something really bad. It could be something that's fairly like neutral. We just have to figure out why the spirit is here and make it move on. It could even be good, right? You could be like a shaman and you're being possessed by helpful spirits, right? So
Or it could
possession,
be it could be undiagnosed epilepsy as well. Is that
right?
not right?
Well, absolutely, right?
Right.
Possession is it is a way of diagnosing something is wrong with somebody. And actually, in the Gospels, most of the people that Jesus is casting spirits out of, the symptoms that they are possessed are things like they are deaf or they are lame, they can't walk. It's a disease of the body, right? It's later that we come to think of possession as being a disease of the soul, right? Where you act like a different person, right? Or a little girl growls in a man's voice, right? That she's Pazuzu or or something like that,
Right.
right?
Right.
Uh, so then once people are possessed, well, the question is, well, why is this person possessed? And the church has had different thoughts on that over the years, but very early on they said, well, it could be that someone cursed you, right? That someone used magic to basically get a demon to attach itself to you. So very early on, there's a connection between basically witchcraft or Satanism and possession. And in the era of witch hunts, if people thought you were possessed by a demon, you could freely say, you know, Billy over there is the person who sent this me into this person. They're a witch, and if you do that, Billy's probably going to die. Right?
Right.
So being possessed actually gives you a lot of power within this culture.
Oh my god. That is awesome. I mean, it really is quite. It's really it's. I mean, they really did, right? They really used it. It was a useful tool to get rid of your enemies or adversaries or people you might have been jealous of or
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. And you know, we don't think of the Salem witch trials as a possession story, but really it was, right? The Puritans understood to be bewitched, right? To have these spasms and things like that. That was because a witch had sent a demon to basically attack you, right? And so once these girls are diagnosed as being bewitched, they can pretty much accuse anybody of being a witch, right? And a lot of people are saying, oh, well, there was hallucinogenic fungus. It's I don't believe that that was true. Those theories were pretty much all debunked very early on. I think that most of these girls were just doing this. One of them even said, well, we did it for the sport, right? It was
Oh, that's
fun to
funny.
act possessed. And then once somebody's dead, you can't really say, oh gosh, I was just kidding. I didn't really want you to hang somebody. Now you've got to ride this out, right? So that seems to have been what was happening.
Right. Oh, oops. Yeah, you can't really do it. That's funny, man. What? So in the Bible, how many actual? As you were saying, it's primarily what? It's the New Testament where the devil is around. Like, so I'm just trying to think of the stories that I can remember, from growing up. Obviously, like Revelations, there's references to the devil. Jesus in the desert, right? That's like the big one, right? Like Mr. Temptation himself. Um, and what's the biggest misunderstood thing about those two stories in regards to the devil that might not have that has been lost in translation?
Right. So the logic of both of those stories is the devil is running the show, right? That God has sort of temporarily left the building and or is asleep at the wheel, sort of, and the devil is running everything. And the arrival of Jesus means that this is about to end, right? That the kingdom of Satan is about to come to an end, and Jesus, as the Messiah, is going to sort of restore the world to the way that God meant it to be. So all the demons recognize Jesus before the humans do, right? So with the story of the Gerasene demoniac, which is where our modern ideas of exorcism come from, where this guy is living in a cemetery and he can rip through chains because he's super strong, and Jesus ends up sending all of the demons out of him into pigs. Those demons recognize who Jesus is immediately before the humans do. And so Satan coming and sort of confronting Jesus in the desert, this is also kind of signifying that Jesus' arrival has cosmic significance, right? This is going to change the order of everything. And then
Mhm.
Revelation, which is the last book written of the Bible, this is kind of the early days of the church where, well, okay, Jesus has come and gone and things actually are worse than before. Right?
Okay.
Because not long after Jesus's crucifixion, there was an uprising against the Romans, and the Romans came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. They crucified everybody trying to defend the city, and it was really, really brutal and awful, right? So clearly, if you think all the bad stuff is coming from Satan, Satan's still very much in power, right? By
Right.
70 CE, and so Revelation is saying, yeah, but actually, we're basically we're going to get our revenge, right? We're gonna things are gonna get really nasty and terrible, but in the end, we will be avenged, and everyone who ever persecuted us, including Satan, they're gonna be cast into a lake of fire for eternity. And when they actually sort of decided what books are going to go in the Bible, there were early Christians who said Revelation is this really nasty book. Right? Like, I
Yeah.
thought our religion was about love, and this is all about punishment and war and lakes of fire. but they decided that it was important enough that for this sort of vision of where history will end according to Christianity to include it. And then today we have Christians who are totally obsessed with Revelation and read everything that happens in the news as sort of the next step in this ancient book, which of course is written in symbolic language, so it can be interpreted kind of however you want.
Right. There was a great meme that was traveling around a few years ago. I'm sure I mean, if you saw it, it was like a guy, he travels through time and he meets up with himself and he's like, what's going on? And he's like, it's like, no, dude, everything's great. He's like, the world is safer, it's better. It's like, what happened? He's like, well, a couple years ago, Jesus came back. He's like, oh, that happened. He's like, oh my God. So everyone was saved. He's like, well, no. It's like he took all the Christians away. And once they, like he promised, and he left us here. And it's like, once they were gone, we started, really focusing on science. We sort of came up with real rules. It's like, we didn't have any of the problems. And it's really, he's like, well, I'll be damned. He's like, you kind of are, but it's great. You know what I mean? It's a really funny sort of bit. And I'm not doing it justice, but it was like that whole idea of revelation in a new way of like, yeah, finally get rid of these people who are holding us all back from civilization. What would you so look, what would you recommend? How would you handle, other than just ignoring them, but like what's the message to somebody who's like says John and I are talking to the devil or we're doing the devil's work, or like what is that sort of like, listen, like how do you, I don't even know if you can ever change someone's mind these days, but what's the messaging on it other than mocking them?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I study religious cultures. I don't really try to change them so much. And I am, like you said, I'm pretty dubious that anything that you say would make them be like, "Gosh, you're right. I guess I was being a little bit,
No, you can't change.
dogmatic."
Those
I
days are over.
I will say though that William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, he was Catholic and he believed in demonic possession. And he, in his last book, he said, the more I look into this, the more I think that these are not demons; these are spirits of the dead. And these are in some cases spirits of the dead behaving very very badly. But I
Hmm.
actually think that these are the dead, and these are not fallen angels or beings of pure hellfire and evil, like my church taught me. So he made that change. I think he made it himself by just sort of being thoughtful about the evidence for a long time. But I find that significant.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That's a pretty wild way to think about it, for sure. Um, let's see. I'm just looking at I have so many questions for you, dude. I'm sure I'm not gonna be able to get through them all. Um, do you find that that people, the more intense that people believe in Satan is how intense they are in their belief in God? Is it like an equal sort of, is it a coin? I mean, is it really like the other side of a coin for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely have people who totally believe in God and don't believe in the devil at all, right? The Nicene Creed doesn't actually say anything about the devil, right? Nicene Creed was composed as sort of the official version of Christianity when the Emperor Constantine convened a council of bishops. And there's a lot of stuff you got to believe according to the Nicene Creed to be a good Christian, right? You got to believe in the
Right. Yep.
resurrection of the dead. Jesus was born of a virgin, spoken of by the prophets. Also, you don't have to believe in a devil, right? So there are some Christians who have said you can have Christianity without the devil. Now, if you believe in the devil, you're probably also going to be a very religious person, and you're gonna also believe in God. The sociologists I mentioned studied who believes in demonic possession and the devil the most, and they mapped this out by cross-referencing that with things like your age, your education level, and so forth. And they found out, well, first of all, they found out if you believe in the devil and demonic possession, you're more likely to live in the South if you live in the United States. That was one big pattern, right?
Hmm.
And you're more likely to be screwed by society, right? You're more likely to make less money, have less education, so forth. So one thing that they kind of postulated is if you have kind of been sort of left behind by society, you are more likely to adopt a view of, yeah, my life could be a lot better, but I know that this is all because of the devil, right? These are the forces of evil doing this to me.
Have they, I'm a other people have said this, and I'm tend to believer in it, that in every accusation is a confession. And has there ever been any studies about from people who are, you know, uh, this is not the right word, but satanic zealots, people who proselytize about Satan at you and like you're with the devil, that they've either had some history of doing wrongdoing or something bad in the past. You know what I mean? Are they more likely? Is there any correlation or connection between people who have done some pretty bad shit who are then accusing people of being Satanists themselves?
Yeah, I think there is. So I wrote a book called Dangerous Games, which was about Christians attacking Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, which was this huge thing back in the
Yeah,
80s.
I remember, dude. I know it well for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So the people at the core of that, like one thing that they were saying is, well, when people play this game of imagination, they basically make themselves insane and they can't distinguish fantasy from reality anymore, right? But
Sure.
if you look at the people making those claims, they were the ones who had a very weak grasp on reality, right? They were the
Right.
ones saying stuff that was totally bonkers. So, for example, there was a chick track, and for folks who don't know, chick tracks are these little comic books, smaller than a postcard, and they usually have some story about someone going to hell. And this guy Jack Chick made them, and you're supposed to leave them at bus stops and things like that to evangelize people. And there was one about Dungeons and Dragons called Dark Dungeon. And you can Google Dark Dungeon and you can go find this. And at the
I will
end of
look
it,
for that for sure.
there's this pastor with his handlebar mustache, and he says, "We're going to burn all of our D&D books." Well, that guy with the handlebar mustache was named John Todd. And John Todd said that he was raised in a witchcraft family in New England, and that his witchcraft name was Lance Collins, and he was part of the Illuminati that controls the whole world. And he would go to churches and he'd say, "I'm raising money to help other witches come to Jesus, but it's going to take a lot of money to,
Oh,
to
dude,
get this to
always
happen, right?"
takes money, dude. It takes
And
money to get people to Jesus.
and then people said, this is the 70s. So people said, your name was Lance Collins and you're from a witch family in New England. Everything you're saying sounds a lot like the soap opera called Dark Shadows that was really big back then.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, you see, when I was a witch, I went to Hollywood and I showed my family diary to these Hollywood producers. So actually, that show is ripping off my life. I'm not making up this bullshit story based on a TV show." And then he eventually like sexually assaulted someone,
Of
and a
course he
trial was
did.
declared, basically too mentally ill to stand trial, and died in a mental institution, right? So you'll talk about someone with a poor grasp on reality, but this was the guy telling everybody, right? Witches are everywhere. D&D will cause people to worship the devil. And most of the people that I found making these claims were like this. I found so many people making utterly insane claims. There's this guy, William Schnobelin, big anti D&D guy, said that he literally was a vampire and fed on human blood
Right.
exclusively.
Of
Uh, you know,
course.
just
Of course he was.
absolutely bizarre stuff. Mike Warnke said he was in charge of 5,000 Satanists in Los Angeles. This was all debunked by an evangelical magazine. So yeah, all these people are big liars, and some of them are also doing pretty nasty stuff
Right.
when they're not making these accusations about others.
Right. Right. It's like that's sort of the thing to me that I feel like when someone would accuse us or in the chat of, you know, being Satanist, I'm like, dude, there's something going on with you that you don't like about yourself that I worry about. That it's really it's fascinating.
Well, and one of my mentors is David Frankfurter at Boston University. He wrote a book called Evil Incarnate. And that book is basically saying, how come throughout history we have said, all our problems are caused by this group of people. They look like everybody else, but they're actually pure evil. And they do these evil rituals, and they eat babies, and they do weird sex stuff, right? These were the claims made in the 80s. But going back in time, these claims were made about witches and Jews, and
Now it's
even
Democrats, by the
right,
way.
Democrats. Yeah, no, it's
Now it's
QAnon
Democrats.
crap. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and this was the same stuff that the early Roman pagans said about Christians. They said Christians eat babies and they do weird sex stuff, right?
That's interesting.
So
Right.
so so Frankfurter says we seem to be kind of hardwired to do this, and he says I think this is a form of intellectual laziness, right? That When
Oh,
you
for
have a
sure.
problem, you could think really hard about what's actually causing a problem, maybe think of some ways to try to solve it. Or you could just say, it's my neighbor, they're a witch.
They're baby eaters, right?
That's
Blame them
right.
for being babies. It's what's the you know we talked about a lot about it, but what would you say? Thank you so much for your time. I really do. I love it. I think it's wonderful. I think our audience is going to love hearing all of this. What are some of the biggest myths about Satanism that should be debunked? What is the what and Satan and Satanism when they use these phrases? What are the biggest ones?
Yeah, so I mean, Satanism, it's a very nebulous word. It doesn't really mean very much. So in 1992, the FBI looked into claims of satanic child abuse. And what the FBI agent said was, it seems to me that Satan means something different to everybody, right? And this was, they said, the Ayatollah of Iran says, we're the great Satan, that the entire United States is Satan. So it doesn't really help us solve crimes to focus on are they satanic or not, because that word doesn't really mean much, right? So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing is that most people who say I am a Satanist do not believe in a literal Satan, right? They are atheists. Anton LaVey was an atheist, so-called non-theistic Satanist. For these people, Satan is kind of like their favorite fictional character that inspires them, right? So one way I
Right.
explain it is like if I have to go to the gym and it's leg day and I don't want to do leg day, but I think that like Batman's really cool, I might be, Batman wouldn't skip leg day, right? Doesn't mean I think Batman's real, right?
Right.
And the other thing is they do not understand Satan as being the Satan of the Bible who hates all mankind. Their idea of Satan comes much later from the Romantic poets of the 1800s. So people like Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, and they kind of reimagine Satan as being kind of the ultimate rebel, someone who won't back down to authority, someone who believes in justice and so on. So that's the Satan that they are kind of looking to as a role model, not the Satan that Christians know of being sort of pure evil and hating humanity.
Now when did the idea of I think I might know the answer, but you can just confirm it for me. Like the idea of this horned demon Satan versus isn't he supposed to be like super good looking and charming, right? Like when did that sort of and how do we take hold of those two versions of him?
Yeah, so the Bible never really says what Satan looks like, right? And there are passages saying, Satan can appear as an angel of light. Most people think that the images that we associate with the devil today are because early Christians were interacting with pagans, right? And so it comes from pagan gods. So the god Pan had horns and goat legs. Hades, the lord of the underworld, had a pitchfork. Right, it was actually called a bident because it has two prongs instead
Mhm.
of three. So Satan gets a pitchfork. But there's also an idea that Satan's a spirit. Satan can have whatever body he wants to have. He can look however he wants. He can appear as a snake, for example. And in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, said, "I think that what happens is spirits they don't have bodies, but they're super fast, so they can like smush together air real fast and condense it into
Sure.
whatever body they want." And so
Okay.
really they can appear however they want to look. They don't have a true form.
So where does that idea of like the super good looking Satan or Lucifer, come from versus, I totally get like, Pan and the half goat thing, and that image of him. But where did the handsome Lucifer come from?
I mean, probably the earliest roots of it are in that passage in Genesis 6, which describes angels taking human women and having sex with them and getting them pregnant, right? And I guess the angels could be really ugly, right? But I think when people hear that story, they think, well, these says they were beautiful women in the text. They probably took the form of beautiful humans. And then in the New Testament, when Satan appears to Jesus in the desert, he takes the form of a tempter. So he is probably trying to appear in a way that will at least make you lower your guard. And then in the
Right.
early modern period, part of the lore becomes that demons are having sex with humans all the time. Right? This is where we get the idea of the incubus and the
Right.
succubus and so on.
Sure.
And in witch trials, people were basically being tortured and made to confess you had sex with the devil, right? So we get all these images of sexy demons and devils. And some people have said, it really seems like it was the religious people interrogating these accused witches who were preoccupied with the devil, and literally asking these women accused of witchcraft questions like, was the devil's penis bigger or the same size as a human? Right? These really kind of salacious questions. They seem to have kind of dirty minds. And one theory of this is there was sort of an idea of maybe this isn't even real. Maybe these people aren't really witches. Maybe there aren't really demons and so forth. But there was an idea that if you have sex with something, it's definitely real, right? This is like to know something in the biblical sense.
Right.
So that by creating this archive of all these witches have admitted that they not only saw demons, they had sex with them. This is sort of helping to prove that this sort of supernatural worldview must be really real. It can't just be a rumor or a hallucination or something.
And then again, it goes back to like, every accusation is a confession, where that guy accusing that poor woman was just coveting her and jealous of her. She was probably sleeping with somebody else. And he's like, did that devil have is he bigger than me? Is he like, I just want to, just before we burn you alive for, if I can't have you, no one will, sort of thing. Which is, I wouldn't be surprised if that's how it went down.
Right. And of course, these women will say anything because they're being tortured. So it's like, yes, the devil has
Oh,
this huge
yeah,
barbed penis.
but
And
not as big as yours,
that's right.
brother John. It's like, it's like, just in case, just, is that get me off the stakes? I don't, it's like, what do we do here? Joe, I can't thank you enough. I find this conversation super fascinating. You make me want to go back to school. I bet your class is a blast. I mean, I bet it's super fun, because these kind of myths and this kind of the constant, religious implications of paranormal that we deal with. Like my nephew and I tend to believe in what my nephew believes. If you do believe in spirits, and do you believe in spirits?
So I am agnostic about all of these things, but I will say that some of the texts that I have found in my research are so weird that I'm really flummoxed as to think of any explanation for what they could be describing. So I teach my students when we look at these things to have modesty, right? We weren't there when these things reportedly occurred. So, yeah, it could be things like undiagnosed mental illness or something, but we don't know that, right? So if we weren't there, I think that we shouldn't rush to assumptions one way or the other.
My nephew's of the belief that he believes that spirits are, because we all have energy in us, right? Brain synapses, literal electric energy that cannot be created or destroyed. And he just is of the mindset and the belief. And I tend to, based on the things I've seen and heard these days being around him, that when we pass, that energy is dispersed. So spirits or ghosts are the memories of the living that is attached to this energy that is dispersed, because nobody really knows what's going on or how the mind works and what happens to our energy. It has to go somewhere. And it's a fun thing and also it's a fun sort of theory to prove and try to talk to other people about it from all different aspects, from like yourself, from a very religious and, based on the accusations we get, I want to answer to these people somehow about what this is versus, pure scientists who are like, it's nonsense. But again, Joe, thank you so much for your time. It is incredibly enlightening, to get into all this, because it's like, look, I love to taunt the audience a little bit with a good Hail Satan every now and again. It's like, I should put an Ozzy picture up here. It's like that's how I grew up, and I love it. It's like it means nothing to me one way or the other than it had the coolest music, like I said before.
Yeah.
And the people that get scared by it, man, they get so scared. They get so scared, and it makes me wonder, like, well, what's going on in your life that this is what you're worried about? Me talking to a spirit and accusing me and pulling me away from it. But that's it, man. That's all I got for you. And I really appreciate your time. And I will certainly point everybody to your books. They should read them. I read the one at the Cambridge books on Satan, it's awesome. It's just great. It's just a wake up. It really is. It's just like, get educated. You know what I mean? It's like, it could so easily have been Mother Goose that could have been the Bible and those stories. You know what I mean? It's like, let's just wise up. But that's it, man. Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Good. Thank you. Take care, man.
All right.
See ya. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Splintered Spirits. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. Now go put on that Ozzy record, even that Beatles record. Maybe even play it backwards, see what happens. I bet nothing does. Just have some fun. Have a good one, guys. See you next time.